I got hired in hell. Today, I had to make a house call. Part 3. I stood under the street lamp with my ancient skull mask in my hand, prepared to don it and become the Grim Reaper under the cover of night. Tonight I was alone, and I was dressed all in black, cargo pants, top, and long pea coat. I must have been an eerie sight. A nearly 30-year-old woman dressed like a ninja with an ominous wooden skull dangling from her hands, softly illuminated by the dusk. At the same time, I was scanning everyone to try to suss out who among them was the damned or the saved. Who was actually a walking soul waiting for me to ferry them to the other side? Across the river, people bled into each other in the rush hour foot traffic, moving sporadically towards some fixed point like blood cells in an artery. I watched the few that drifted over the bridge onto my side of the river. It was hard for me to tell the dead from the living. They looked the same to me, only the dead were sometimes a bit more ragged, betraying their cause of death. The woman who approached me, however, did not look ragged at all. She looked the same as the living. Smoothed black-gray hair, pearl earrings fastened to her slightly elongated earlobes. Steady gait, although her boots had a high heel. She did not look sickly, battered, or dismayed, and there were no clues to whether she was going to heaven or hell. I only noticed she was heading my direction when she hesitated in front of the Japanese cafe, teetering in her high heels beneath the dragon painted on the storefront. Still looking over her shoulder, she veered course and headed towards me, bunching the front of her beige jacket in her hand. I raised my hands to my face, feeling the cool wood of the skull mask. It was on tight. I could feel my skin pressed against it at every curve. "Are you here for me?" I asked. She nodded. "Open your mouth." "I beg your pardon?" She was trying her best to look offended, but she accepted. The inside of her mouth was pale pink with blue reflex in the streetlight. "Lift up your tongue," I instructed. I was glad we were not visible to mortals anymore, as this part was always a bizarre spectacle. A gold coin lay shimmering behind her teeth. I picked it up and flipped it over. The pentacle was etched deeply, the sign she would be delivered to heaven. "All right," I said. "Get in the boat." She didn't move. "You're from around here," she said pointedly. "I am?" "That's not what I expected," she clipped. "It's not what I expected either," I said as I let her down the steps and into the gondola. I rowed the woman east, down the river and out towards the sea, watching the city pass her by for the last time as we sailed through. The moon shifting behind the swollen purple clouds gave the illusion that time was passing, but in reality we were in a timeless void. It was a final commute for the dead to mourn the familiar aspects of time and space and city. The woman sat perched in the back of the boat. She said nothing. She had with her a little purse, and for a second I wondered if this was allowed. I wondered if I should act more like a prison guard and prevent her from sneaking contraband into heaven. I figured the angel would handle that when I handed her over to the next divine messenger. I rowed out to where the river's mouth opened into the sea, and saw the other boat in the distance. I sailed closer, buoyed by the waters, traversing the place where the ocean had given way into a massive crater last night. The woman's eyes lay fixed on the angel in the opposite boat. They were wearing the bizarre mask that looked like the welder's helmet again, boxy with the silver band around the eyes, and the metal wings affixed to their back. "Who is that?" the woman asked me. "Your guess is as good as mine, really," I said. "I think of them like an angel, 'cause they bring you to heaven, but I have no idea what they are." She shrugged. So did I. The intricacies of this job were not for me to know. I'm not sure it would have made it any easier if I did know. Our boat gently collided with the angels, bumping them back. I was scared they would say something about it, but they remained silent. I looked at the woman, and she looked back at me, waiting for my guidance. "Well, up you go," I said. I felt foolish for acting so flippant, but I was trying to mirror the nonchalance with which Melvin, my supervisor, had acted when he gave me the walk-through. She hesitated, but got up and waddled to the front of the boat. The angel held out a gloved hand, which she examined closely before accepting. They lifted her effortlessly into their boat. "That's done, I guess," I said, feeling sheepish under the angel's steady gaze. I did not know what kind of formalities should exist between us. Them, the delivery boy of heaven, and me, the delivery boy of hell. "See you later," I said, a small gesture of familiarity. I docked under the street lamp and resumed my position of scanning for wayward souls. I squirmed underneath my mask. My novel confidence had worn off, and now I felt uncertain of my footing in this other realm, unworthy of my bizarre costume. I had little time to wallow in my insecurity before the next soul arrived. Unlike the woman, this soul made a beeline to me without hesitation. He was young, battered, a tuft of light brown hair hanging limply down the center of his head. His eyes were fixed ahead, but vacant. His cheeks were gaunt and caved in, creating little semicircular lines around the edges of his mouth. He was clearly not of the living. Even I could tell that. "Open your mouth," I told him, even though he was standing too far away from me to be able to reach in. "What do you mean?" he called back. His voice was tinny sounding. "Just open it." "No, I don't even know who you are." He stood unevenly, his shoulders slanted down. Black nylon straps hung from his jacket. I took a second look at him through my mask. Then I swallowed, hard. "You don't need to know who I am. It's better if you don't," I said. I stepped towards him and he opened his mouth slowly. One of his canines was missing. "Lift your tongue." He did. There was nothing there. No coin. My head flushed hot with anxiety. I tried to remember what Melvin had told me to do in these situations. "Where's your payment for the passage? The coin?" I asked. "I don't know what you're talking about, kid," the boy said. He shook his head lazily. "Who took it?" I said through gritted teeth. "No one, I told you. I don't know." I grabbed his shoulder, although he was taller than me, and I had to reach up to shake it. "I know someone took the coin. Now tell me who took it." He looked down, then back up at me like a dog who had torn up the sofa. He was ashamed. "You're the one who beat the other poor lad to death, aren't you? The one who killed his foster brother." I dropped my hand from his shoulder, remembering how the other boy with the black hair had clung to me before handing himself into the abyss of hell. I don't know how I knew it was his killer standing in front of me now, but I sensed it. "'Twas a sick thing he'd done," the boy said, "and he was laughing about it and all. I couldn't take it." His voice was thick with condemnation, but he seemed weak. I looked at his skinny legs and wondered how he could be powerful enough to kill anyone. "Just tell me where the coin is," I said. "Did you hide it?" He shook his head no. "My parents took it," he said. "Thought they could get some money from it." I nodded. The lower half of my face was tense. "Take me to them," I said. He looked up at me, eyes full of pity. I could not tell if his sorrow was due to his own misery or his shame for me and the task I was about to carry out. But he nodded, sullenly, and motioned for me to turn around and follow him up the street. We passed my own home on the way there. I peered in the gate, thinking of how Derek was probably in there, curled up in bed, frozen in time as I slunk around in the supernatural night. I felt a spot of warm compassion in my gut, painfully juxtaposed with the role I was playing now. I was at odds with myself, like two seismic plates shifting against each other, but perhaps this was more in my nature than I knew. I followed the boy through a maze of alleys and decrepit gates. We cut through the grassy, litter-strewn banks of estates and cement steps that led nowhere. He led me down a regimented street cramped with conjoined houses and patchy courtyards covered in cigarette butts and scraps of metal. He pointed to a faded yellow house with moss growing out of the shingles. A gray minivan sat next to it. The passenger window had been broken and a network of sellotape made up for the empty space. I saw a shadow of a 3 on the side of the door, an address that had long since corroded and fallen off, leaving a ghostly outline of rust and damp in its image. A new 3 had been drawn freehand on the door, with permanent marker as a replacement. The boy motioned to the door with a flourish. He leant on the side of the house and lowered his eyes. I knocked 3 times. It sounded hollow. I heard a skittering from inside the house like someone had thrown an aluminum pan across the floor, then hushing and a baby crying. "Who is it?" someone said from inside. Their voice was high-pitched and clipped. I could not tell if it was a man or a woman's voice. "It's about your son," I said. There was a pause while the person inside considered. "Which one?" I froze, remembering I didn't know the boy's name. Whoever was in the house must have sensed my uncertainty because I heard footsteps and their rattling breath retreated. I knocked on the door again, harder this time. "Let me in!" I shouted. "You need to let me in!" There was the shuffling of more steps from inside the house. The rattling breath returned. "It's not the guards, is it?" a quieter voice whispered behind the door. No, can't be," the other replied. "I'm not with the guards," I said, bracing both of my hands on the door. "But you need to let me in. It's important." I heard the lock slide and I put all my weight on the door, pushing it into somebody's body as soon as they opened it. I heard a yelp and then the weight of them fall to the floor. A baby started crying from the back room. A child, about 10 or 11, scurried away from me. Her long, lank hair swished from side to side as she ran. I wrenched the door shut behind me. It reverberated hollowly against the frame. The woman I had pushed down lay curled up in front of me. She was wearing a bright pink jacket and her hair was tied tightly in a black bun, thin at the hairline from years of pulling it back. She lowered her hands from her face. They were shaking. She wailed and looked at me from the corner of her eyes. She was missing one of her front teeth. "What do you want?" she cried. "Where is it?" I seethed. I had forgotten that I was wearing a mask and almost felt ashamed at how intimidating I must seem. "I don't know what you're on about," she yelped, rocking back and forth on the floor. Just then, a man emerged from the back of the house. Although he held his hands squarely at his sides, he looked small and weak. His blue t-shirt hung off him, and his cheekbones protruded out of his face like two flat ledges. He was bald and had a scab on the top of his head that caught the light like a dim ruby. "What have you done to her?" he shouted at me. I strode towards him before he had a chance to get any closer to me. I stared down from behind the polished wood of my skull. I could see his fear growing behind his eyes, gurgling up from his gut and into his brain. "Where is the coin?" I said again. His jaw clenched. He swallowed. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said evenly. I thrust my arm out and sent him teetering back into the wall. His body felt light, like cardboard, like a bird's carcass. I stormed to the back of the house and to the kitchen. There were cans and bits of aluminum and boxes of baby formula and dirt-spotted toys on every surface. The hob was caked with grease. Pots and pans cluttered the sink. The clock on the microwave read 18:03. I shoved everything onto the floor, picking at everything shiny in hopes of recovering the coin. Nothing shone except the unburnt bits of foil that caught the light like kaleidoscopes. "Where did you hide the coin?" I shouted. "You left your son abandoned, out in the streets," I shouted. I wheeled around to see them staring at me in the doorway. The woman, the girl, and the man, now with the baby in his arms. I couldn't tell if they were listening to me anymore, but they were watching me with their mouths agape. I strutted towards them. "You don't understand what you've done," I said, more quietly now. "Your son is out in the cold, wearing the same clothes he died in, and that's how he'll stay if you don't give me the coin you stole from him." The man handed the baby over to the woman. They both started crying quiet sobs. I realized that the woman may hardly be much older than me, though her face was aged with tan splotches and thin creases around her mouth like spider webs. I wondered if she knew that I was a woman behind the mask. Not that it mattered. I wondered if she ever went fishing with her grandparents on the river and felt power as a fish flopped for life in her hands, its body pulling towards the water, and only she could decide whether to free it or eat it, like I had done. I wondered how different we really were from each other. The man looked down from me and stared at the floorboard. "Follow me," he said softly. He led me up the carpeted stairs silently and opened the door to a box room. He knelt down and opened the bottom door in a narrow chest of shelves. His body looked disproportionately large against the small patch of carpet. He pulled a lavender sock out from the back of the drawer and unfurled it to reveal the golden glint of the coin. Tentatively, he held the coin flat in his hand like he was not quite sure of its power. I took it from him. "We meant him no harm." the man said, still squatting on the carpet with his arms hanging down, crossed at the wrist. We didn't know what it was, just thought it was money. I nodded and descended the stairs. The clock on the microwave still read 1803. I shut the door quietly behind me and hoped they never would remember this time-warped interaction. Outside the house, I looked at the coin in my hand. I flipped it over. It was blank. The boy was going to hell. Our journey out to the sea was nearly silent. The boy sat huddled in the back of the boat, the city drifting by in a timeless fog. As we approached the river's mouth, he spoke. "My family's all right, are they?" he asked. "They're grand," I lied. "They've no trouble with you, do they?" he said. "No." "Sound," he whispered. He was quiet for a moment, watching the rippling water. "They're good people," he said. "They never mean any harm." I nodded, staring straight ahead. On the horizon, the water was giving way to form a crevice in the earth. I rowed towards the rupture with steady determination. The sound of water crashing got louder and louder, and the darkness of the pit became blacker and blacker. I felt powerful as I approached it and leaned in, looking down towards nothingness. "This is where I leave you," I said, turning to the boy. "What do you mean?" he said. He was still sitting, braced against the back of the boat. "You have to get up," I said. "You have to go down there," I said, pointing at the black infinity. He cautiously craned his neck to look over. "But what's down there?" he asked. "Will it kill me?" "I don't know," I said. "But you're already dead." I took his hand and hauled him up. His wrists were thin and clammy. "It won't hurt," I said, even though I didn't know. He teetered to the front of the boat, peering down into the crack in the earth that seemingly had no end. I started to open my mouth to usher him on, but he spoke first. "It's all right," he said. "I trust you." He held my hand as he balanced on the front of the boat. Then he let go and closed his eyes and leapt into the void. His hair and clothes did not ripple as he descended. It was as if he was receding into a vacuum. That night I sat on the bed and sobbed. Salt tears and snot webbed my face. My chin dripped with the runoff. Derek creaked open the door and offered me a cup of tea. I looked up at him, pathetically, and took the mug between my hands, pulling it into my chest. He rubbed my back in small circles. My spine felt rigid against his hand. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. I could hardly speak. My throat felt as if it was sticking together, and my words came out as garbled cries. "I had to go to this house to find a stolen coin, and I pushed this woman to the ground." I buried my hands in my face, smearing my damp tears around. "I nearly hurt her," I said. "The baby was crying, everyone was shouting." "You pushed a woman to the ground?" Derek repeated. "Yes, like with a door. She wouldn't let me in, and I hit her with the door." Derek pulled his hand from my back like he had been burnt by my skin. "Why did you hit her?" he said, looking deep into my streaked face. "I don't know. I didn't mean to hit her. I meant to open the door, but I don't know. I just had to get the coin, like..." My voice became more high-pitched and frantic. Strings of sentences escaped through my closing throat, dangling in the air, unlinked to any other thought. I let out a guttural sob. "Why are they making you do this? It isn't right," Derek said. "Why are you doing this?" "It's what I was told," I screeched, snot webbed through my fingers. He shook his head. "It's not like you, Sarah, to be violent." "I'm not a violent person, I swear," I sobbed. Derek put his hand on my shoulder. He must have sensed the desperation in my cries, and my primal fear that I was not the person he thought I was. "You need to stand up to them," he said. "You have the chance to make a difference with this job, more of a difference than most of us ever will make." He was shaking my shoulder gently with his hand so that my whole body resonated with his words. I took my wooden mask from beside my bedside table and held it between my snotty hands. "You're right," I said as I cleared my throat. I put my palm over the mask, pushing my fingers into the smooth, vacant eye sockets. "This isn't who I am."